We can see the next slide and the current slide.
Okay, so that, okay, thank you, Zhang.
I'll do a bit of an introduction. Are you ready, Jay?
Okay, give me 1 second. Okay. So they see both slides, both the window. Why?
Okay. Ah, it works now.
Yeah, all right, fantastic.
Right. Okay, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so welcome to the next bit. So this is the tutorial, which we've got in 3 sessions, and we've got our first speaker, Jenny Zhang, who will talk about combating misinformation on social media.
Yay,
okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So, so this tutorial will have 3 parts. So you can see that this is joint work with Zhang. Zhang is online. So I will do the first part, and then Zhang will do the second part online, and then it come back to me to the last part. So the topic of the tutorial is, as you can see there, combating misinformation on social media from detection to mitigation. Okay, let me try to move my slide. And as what I said, there are 3 parts. And the first part, I will talk about misinformation and human perception. That will be about for 30 minutes, and then I will hand it over to Zhang to do the second part. Okay, so human perception and misinformation. And everyone knows, I think, social media is a platform that make it our life much easier to get information, to share information. But on the other hand, it also has everyone has recognized it is a double-edged sword, and there is also all sorts of unverified information going around on social media. So that's what we are going to talk about, the first point. And then I'm going to talk about people's perception about the credibility of information on social media. And then we talk about some user study that we did and the findings about user perception. Okay, so did I miss one? Okay, so social media, the content of social media is more than a text-based form. It has user-generated contents like text posts and comments and photos and video and audios and videos. And it also has these connections that you can see there on there. There is a network people can share, and there is also the social network that connecting users and groups. So which makes it a interesting platform to share information. And there was this very famous paper, actually. This is a early paper from 2010. And this paper examined, what is Twitter? Is it a social network for socialization, or it is a news media that people share information on there? So the news, what we mean by news is not only the news from the newspaper media, but also any new events, anything people see, or any a disaster on the road. So that's what, like it is found in that paper that it is it's much more than a social network. It is more for people to share information. So which is good. And that's why the Twitter user has grown dramatically from that study in 2010. But then on the other hand, I've also shown there, these are 2 studies in 2018. Actually, interestingly, there are 2 papers in the Science, in the same issue of the Science magazine, talking about the issue of fake news or false news. Here, they use the term news very loosely, not newspaper type of news, but any information novel information they're sharing. So this particular paper, The Science of Fake News, is specifically talking about political fake news for people talking about that's the topic of this, the science of fake news. And this study, the other study in the same issue, is talking about the spread, or they call it false news, which basically is true and false information on online, specifically using the Twitter platform. They studied actually 10 years of data, and the findings there is actually a bit, like not surprising, but very interesting. And they found that false information actually has a longer cascade, propagate farther and wider and quicker, and has deeper impact than the true information, which is really disappointing. But the reason for that is people find very often the false information, they are novel. Because of the novelty, people tend to spread that quickly, more quickly and wider. Okay, and so that's the start. People start to examine the fake news and false information. And the false information on social media is especially manifested during the COVID-19 period. When it first started, when there was the policy of mask, it wasn't there yet. Vaccine. There are various rumors and with different sayings going around. And the world, actually there's a term there, the World Health Organization has used, they call it infodemic. It's not only a pandemic of virus, and it is actually a pandemic of information, all sorts of misinformation actually. So the World Health Organization actually publish frequently appearing, they have gathered the false information about COVID-19 and clarify it and correct it on the World Health Organization. So what is misinformation? So we see that just now, the social media platform is a double-edged sword, and there is, it's easy for information sharing, but on the other hand, it is also a platform for people to spread false information. So we use this term misinformation to refer to any incorrect, sorry, I'm just trying to check the time so that I can follow it exactly. And any incorrect or misleading information. Okay, I'm used to generally refer to inaccurate information. And specifically, if we talk about misinformation, it would include all sorts of inaccurate information, include false claims by political leaders or political parties, or rumors that are circulated around about COVID-19 on social media platforms, or political fake news like that. Like here, RMIT has, in joint with ABC, has a ABC fact check service. So journalism really check the claims, the false claims by political leaders, okay, and rumors, and also it includes disinformation, which are people deliberately to deceive people, like troll activities. Okay, so we use misinformation as a general term to refer to all sorts of inaccurate and misleading information. So, given this information environment, all sorts of misinformation on social media platforms, what we studied was trying to understand users' perception. That is, how users of social media platforms believe in the information that is presented to them. So there's a definition that I quoted there. It is called credibility. So in credibility, that is how people, the level that people believe in the information that is presented or accept it as true and real, and whether really the information is true or not, but it's people's perception of it. Okay, and this is a type in information behavior studies. This is a type of information behavior. It is like trust information type of information behavior. Do we believe in what is said? So here is an example here. You see, this is a tweet with a photo with a picture in there in 2012. Actually, if you look at the hashtag there is about Hurricane Sandy. Okay, now what do you think of this tweet from Twitter? Is this true or false? Back then, like when we did a study, we asked people, do you believe this? This is saying that the New York Police Department is flooded and there's a picture with it. Do you believe in it? By looking at it, if you don't have that background information, or if you have the background knowledge, do you believe in it is true or not? It looks like true, right? So we collected 11 users, and what do you think? And here is you can see a distribution of different judgments. These are people's perception. 6 people believe it is very credible. And, and 1 says, somewhat credible. And then 3 says, no, it's not credible. Maybe they have the relevant background knowledge already. Or 1 says, I cannot decide. So that's the kind of study we have done. We gathered, this different news presented on Twitter. We present to users and gather their understanding or their perception of the credibility of the information presented to them. So we want to study what are the user demographic information that correlate with their judgment of the credibility. Okay, will education improve their judgment of the credibility of information? Will their age or gender, like the demographic attributes, would that correlate with their judgment? And also, when it's presented with something like that, what features from the tweet, from that Twitter post, would users use to make that judgment? And are there any contributing factors other than the tweet content that people have used to make that judgment? Or, very last one, because we have so many machine learning systems predicting the credibility of information as well, trying to detect rumors, make those predictions, how do humans compare with machines when in terms of the judgment? You will be surprised by the results that we found. Okay, so what we did to collect the data, so we collect the Twitter news. So basically, we used keyword search on Twitter to find the relevant news. You will see more details on the next slide. And then we also collect the user demographic information, and we send out designed questionnaires on crowdsourcing platforms to collect the user demographic information. And then we collect the user ratings of their credibility. Okay, again, make use of the crowdsourcing platforms. And then we do the analysis. What we did was, chi-square analysis and associative analysis to find out, to do analysis of the data that we have collected. So this is the crowdsourcing platform that we have used. Initially, we used, I don't know, if you have done user study, initially it started with Crowdflower, and then it became Figure 8, and now it becomes part of Appen. But anyway, it is there. But then we have to move to Amazon Mechanical Turk. That is a widely used crowdsourcing platform. So of course, because it is crowd workers, so we need to ensure data quality. To ensure data quality, of course, we have to specify the qualification level for the crowd workers, and also insert random gold questions to ensure the data quality. What we did, what we have done there to design some very easy, obvious questions and throw it out the page. If they can't get it right, then we will filter out that worker. So basically for quality control. Okay, so in the end, we actually, this is some description of the user study we have collected. So the users, we have 7 recruited, actually, it's a large scale study, 754 users, crowd workers from 76 countries. And we collected their demographic attributes. And you can see that, gender, age, education, location. And then we did different levels, young and old for age, and also the into different categories like Boomer, Generation X, Y, and Z. So that's for age, in addition to the original collection of the age range. Okay, and education, there is pre-university, under university, below university level and above university level, and also then a more detailed classification of the education, different education levels, and as well as location. So we collected the country level. from the country, we divided into, like several categories, like Asia Pacific, America, Europe, and Africa. And then we further aggregated into Eastern and Western. So here is a distribution. This table shows the distribution of the data that the demographic information about the data for the users we have collected. And on the Twitter posts, as what I said, we used keyword search, and from these news media, major news media sources, and we collected 20 news topics, and we used the topic keywords to find the relevant Twitter posts. And so keywords, there are a few examples that we have used there. Say, for example, US government shutdown, Navy yard shooting, earthquake in Pakistan. Those are all reported in the major news platforms. And by the way, this was by then the newsworthy events at that time. So this study was done in 2014. Okay, and then these 20 news topics actually are designed because we want to study different types of news. So specifically, and 3 types, breaking news, political news, and disaster news within 4 years. Okay, and also from other news attribute that we have paid attention to when we design the news posts to collect the data on Twitter posts is whether the topic is on the trending, on the trending list of Twitter, or it is none, or otherwise it is not trending. Okay, and we also when we collect the data, we make sure that we have a balanced distribution of the writing style, whether the tweet is expressing an opinion or emotion, or it is about some fact. Okay, so, and this table summarizes the news attributes that, in terms of the distribution along the different dimensions of the news attributes that we have collected. So, and then with the news posts, with the user demographics, we collect their credibility ratings. So you can see here, we set it to 4 levels. And the reason we don't have this thing in the middle, cannot decide is in the middle, and we don't use the 5-level scale. And the reason is we deliberately remove maybe credible in between and definitely not credible and somewhat credible. Deliberately not include maybe credible because we did a preliminary study. And people always put, if you have maybe credible, they will always choose that. We don't have valid data. So, so this is the a sample interface on the Amazon, on the Crowdflower platform. So you can see here, we collected the demographic information. We asked them to judge the credibility level. And also then we asked them, what attributes, what Twitter features do you use to make your judgment? So we give them some prompt. Say, do you look at the tweet source? Do you look at the language? Do you look at the transmission, the topic? So I'll give you an example what we mean by the different types. So you can see here, and the free text input, we want to look at what are the features that people use. So these are the different types of features we have gathered, and we put them into different categories. And to put this into context, to show you an example. So in this example here, for example, we ask, okay, this is author. Do you use the author source? Does it have a picture? Does that change that, make you to make the judgment? And also things like RT, retweet, or add someone, or a username. So that's a transmission feature. And all these URLs in there, or the picture of Steve Jobs, and these are auxiliary features, and also the topic. So Steve Jobs is the searching keyword. You can see here, these are the keywords we used to come up with the death of Steve Jobs. So they are the topic, related features. So, and then the writing style, say, For example, so this one is a factual type of writing. So it just states the fact that died at age 56. Is not saying rest in peace, Steve Jobs. That's more emotional or opinion. Okay, so the writing style. So we collected all these features after I have got the user demographics, the Twitter posts, and collected all the ratings, and then we do our analysis. So the analysis we have done, we actually did, yeah. Oh, okay. So we did ask them in the free text. We did ask them, and there are some people reported that they use prior knowledge because they know this is true or false, but not a huge lot of people reported to use prior knowledge. But that's a very good point. We did collect that. Yeah. Just to add to what your question, so what we want to judge actually is whether they use they have prior knowledge or not, based on the surface features they see immediately directly on the screen. How do we make the judgment? That's the features we are collecting mainly. Yeah.
So it's based on just one tweet only, like not what else is on this.
No, just one tweet, just like this tweet is presented to you. Yeah. Okay. So, and then we did correlation analysis, see if there is the user's demographic information has anything to do with their credibility ratings. Okay, and what we found is only location is significantly correlated with their credibility ratings at all levels, whether it is from country or different continent, or it is the Western or the Eastern part. Okay, so, there is a very interesting finding there, which I haven't included in here. It is African, people from Africa especially want to say this is, cannot decide the credibility. I think maybe that's the significant, it stands out, that's the pattern there. It's because we looked at as what you see here, we use this correlation rule to look at, what's the combination that contributed to a very high chi-square value there. So that stands out, and which is interesting. Location generally is very significantly correlated, and specifically the combination of Africa and cannot decide is that combination gives the highest dependence. Okay, and education is also strongly correlated with the credibility judgment, and we also found that the strongest dependence comes from professional education combination with the not credible rating. So which is interesting as well. Okay, so I didn't give the further discussion, and then we relate this to, we further analyze that, because there are credibility study in other contexts, not social media, for example, the web, or generally the online information. So our analysis revealed that the social media shows somewhat a different pattern from the online information generally, people's perception. Okay, and here we are trying to look at the correlation between the news attributes and the credibility. Basically, they're saying, whether it is breaking news, would that make a difference? So here it says the strong dependence for breaking news and very credible. And if it is breaking news, people tend to say this is very credible. And trending correlate with credibility as well. So which is saying that if you appear in the trending section of Twitter has a big impact on people's judgment of credibility. Okay, and so these are the details are shown in that table that you can see. And we also do the correlation analysis of user demographics and the news attributes. And you can see the result is there. The age correlates with what year the news is happened, and the location correlates with the news type, and the user location correlates with news year. So I think that is straightforward. And this is an interesting study I want to show you. And you can see here, there are some little dots here. So these are the dots that is the credibility level that is predicted by this machine learning algorithm. It's called TweetCred. And this is something developed by a group they predict regardless of people's perception, just based on various features that they gathered from the tweets to predict the credibility level. Okay, so which means this is like the machine thinks whether this is credible or not. And you can, this stars is a 7 level. So this is, you know, six out of 7 that is saying this is credible. Okay, now this is the result I want to show you. And TweetCred is the tool, is the machine learning prediction. And you can see, look at this, we have altogether 1,316 tweet posts that are predicted by the machine. And this is a distribution of the 4 categories: very credible, somewhat credible, and not credible. You can see that, you know, not evenly distributed, but, you know, roughly, you know, we have some in very credible, somewhat credible, and not credible. But this is the reader, the user's perception. They say whether it is credible or not. Look at the distribution here. So majority would say very credible, and a very significant number. And a smaller number says somewhat credible. And only 8 out of 1,316 judgments said this is not credible. So, and that's why we find that humans are really credulous than machines about the tweets that are presented to them, which explains why you know, rumors spread so quickly on the social media platform. Just people, you know, first sight, because it is novel information, you know, like we did some further analysis, the emotions, maybe they just feel this is novel, I just want to share it, and they believe it. Okay, so that's what we have discovered, which humans are more credible, are more credulous than the machines in judging things. And then we did some further analysis about, you know, the features. You remember that we collected the what features you use to make the judgment. Why do you make that the rating? So what we have found is, you know, like different people, because their demographic attributes are all somewhat correlated with the credibility features. You know, we looked at transmission topic, auxiliary, you know, all those different features that they have reported they have used. And most correlated is the topic and the style features that people use a lot to make their credibility judgment. And the least correlated is the transmission features in the tweets. And also we have shown that, we have found that author and auxiliary and transmission, they're not used by itself, but frequently used with others and together to make their, for users to make their credibility judgments, and the details in that result table. So from here, what's next? What we are working on now is how can we make use of these findings to turn them into strategies for publishing effective, truthful information to convince end users, especially say for fact-checking services, for official news medias, to help them to say, to design such systems. And also, our finding about location is so important for the credibility judgments of users, is suggesting that for different areas, maybe we should have location-based information services. And this is a topic, the last topic, especially what I think I'm really interested in is, you know, given that people are so credible, so credulous and so easily believe information presented to them, and now with the machine, you know, something like ChatGPT that can generate language and so easily, large chunk of text, what about the human's perception of the machine-generated text? If there is adversarial usage of the machine-generated text and to generate misinformation, how can we cope with that? How can we let our machine-generated information to be, you know, to tell users that, to help us to find out how users perceive those type of information, and particularly do users use the same type of features for the for the machine-generated text? So that's something we want to study further. And so this is acknowledgement. And my PhD student, Shafiza, who graduated, and my colleague, Professor Mark Sanderson. And here's a list of relevant papers if you're interested in finding out more. I think that's 30 minutes. Sorry, I'm 2 minutes over. And with that, hand over to Jayhan. If you have any questions, I'm happy to discuss offline during the afternoon tea. So over to you, Jayhan.
Yep. Let me share my, can you unshare? Yeah, and I can try to share.
How to spell stop sharing? Okay.
Okay. You all can see my screen? Yes? No?
Both sides.
Okay. Okay. If you can't see my screen, give me a yell. So yeah, I'm gonna continue to talk about the second part of the tutorial, which is about misinformation detection. One thing I want to mention is this is only 1 hour, so what you see here is really just a very brief overview of the whole area of misinformation detection. I'm not going to dive very deep into any methodology or any particular paper, but I will show some representative methods and data sets. But anyway, you might find it a little bit shallow and superficial, but that's largely because of the coverage that I want to do. But hopefully that will give you enough information, to go in and dive deeper if you're interested in particular areas or papers. So with that, yep, I'm gonna just start. So I'm not gonna really talk too much to motivate misinformation, because I think Jenny has done a great job to talk about how how much harm misinformation can do. And COVID-19 is a great sort of example that showed us real sort of social impact that it has. But one thing that I do want to just quickly mention, though, about social media is that beyond social media just being a free platform that people can broadcast and talk about anything, one thing that is perhaps a little bit subtle about social media is that because of its very aggressive recommendation system, where it would try to sort of push you to recommend you to interest groups or people to follow and whatnot. And the algorithm behind it tends to sort of push you towards people or groups with similar sort of beliefs and philosophy. And so what it does sort of as a side impact, which is not really intended by these social media companies, is that it creates echo chambers and filter bubbles. And echo chamber and filter bubbles can be very dangerous because it amplifies misinformation propagation. And the reason why that's the case is because if you are in an echo chamber, having people that share your beliefs, all these people, you trust these people a lot more, and therefore anything that they say, you're more likely to have confidence that what they say is correct. And so therefore misinformation spreads even more quickly within echo chambers and filter bubbles. And this red and blue sort of picture that you see there is actually the interaction between democratic to the users and Democrats and also Republican users. And you can see most of the interactions within group rather than across groups. And that sort of really visualize the sort of the effect of information propagation within filter bubbles. So I guess I should at least motivate. We all know misinformation is very damaging and all that, but I should at least motivate why we want to do detection. Well, because there's so much misinformation and so much harm it can do. It's not unreasonable to think that the first thing that you want to do is to try to detect misinformation first. And if you are able to detect misinformation automatically, then you can use it to say alert users potentially of misleading content that they're reading online, or journalists, of potential news stories that require some sort of fact checking, or potentially even for defense agencies to make them aware of mass influence activities that's happening at the moment. So these are some of the very obvious sort of benefits if we're able to detect misinformation reliably. But beyond that, of course, it's important to acknowledge that tackling or combating misinformation is really a difficult process. It's a really complex process, and detection alone is never going to solve the whole problem. But detection will at least will be the first step to enable all these different other types of corrective measures. And you'll see some in the third part of Jenny's talk, how to mitigate these misinformation. So ultimately, I see detection as sort of the first step, to do many other things to combat misinformation. So let's look at in our literature how misinformation is typically framed. What sort of task is it typically framed? If you search misinformation detection on Google Scholar, you're not very likely going to find exact task that's called misinformation detection, and that's largely because it's framed in two different tasks. The first task is what we call automated fact-checking, which is very popular in NLP. And in automated fact-checking, the goal is that given a particular claim, we want to verify its veracity or truthfulness. So something like if you have a claim like sea level rise is not accelerating, automated fact-checking is about trying to predict that, hey, this is not quite right, this is false. So that's automated fact-checking. Another task that you'll see, maybe not so much in NLP, but more in sort of the data science conferences, is the rumor detection task, where the goal is to try to identify unverified stories on social media. So something like this, where maybe someone on Twitter wrote a story, like in this case in the green box, that says 17-year-old unarmed kid shot 10 times by police for stealing candy. I don't know, that was punishable by death. And then you have lots of people, it triggered the whole conversation from there. But rumor detection is about identifying, these news stories being posted by people and saying that, hey, potentially this is a rumor that it's not verified yet. So that's rumor detection. So in the next sort of 1 hour or so, what I'll do is I'm going to basically talk about these two tasks, automated fact-checking and rumor detection, in terms of its task definition, some of the representative methods, although in a very shallow manner, as I sort of stress, and also what are some of the data sets that we have for these two different tasks. And lastly, I'm going to come back and then talk about some of the challenges in misinformation detection, and mostly largely, discuss some of the things that I feel is important at the moment that needs to be addressed. So this challenges bit will be more about discussion from my thoughts, my perspective on misinformation detection in the field. Okay, so we'll start with automated fact-checking. So in automated fact-checking, typically this is broken down into a pipeline of a few steps. So given a claim like this, like sea level rise is not accelerating, generally you would first have what we call an evidence retrieval step, where the goal here is that given a claim, you want to retrieve some related evidence that could give you more information about the claim. So here, it's say it might have search Google, or it might have search some knowledge sources and find out some evidences that's related to sea level rise. And then once you have gathered these evidence passages, then the last step is the verdict prediction, where you will take into account the claim and all these evidences to try to predict the verdict, whether this is a false statement or whether this claim is refuted by the evidence or not. And so in the next sort of few slides, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first talk about the evidence retrieval process, and then afterwards talk about the verdict prediction process. And I'm going to, for each of the steps, I'm going to talk about the task definitions, the labels, some representative methods and whatnot. Okay, so let's look at evidence retrieval. So in evidence retrieval, the aim is to find more information. beyond what you're given in the input claim. And this additional information come in all sorts of forms, all sorts of modalities. The simplest one would be just metadata, data that you have that's immediately associated with the claim, or you could find more information in terms of textual evidence or potentially more structured data like table or tuples from knowledge bases, or you can find more information in terms of images, videos, and whatnot. The simplest one, the metadata that I mentioned, these metadata, sometimes you might come with it, with the input that you have. For example, you might have the publication source, you might have the author who wrote the claim. All these information could be very informative. And sometimes just by looking at the publication source or the author profile can tell you whether this is, this piece of information is potentially dodgy or not. That can tell you quite a bit. But that said, using just metadata, looking at metadata alone, it's never going to help you explain why and how a particular claim is untruthful. It's not going to explain anything that's specific to the claim. It will tell you that the explanation is this author is not credible, and you therefore shouldn't believe what they wrote. But it's not going to tell you exactly logically or what's the issue with the particular claim. And so that's why we want to do something beyond just using the metadata. So textual evidence is something that's very common. You'll see this in NLP a lot, where here, given the claim, we try to rely on some external knowledge source, typically document collections, to try to fetch more information about the claim. So here are some example papers that use different types of external knowledge. For example, you can see two use news sources, like either the headlines or the news articles. Another Torn 2018 uses Wikipedia, which is basically treating Wikipedia as the knowledge source. One thing to take note here, though, is that the claim in this particular data set is actually synthetic in the sense that they're not real-world claims. But we'll get to that once we talk about data set. But either way, this is treating Wikipedia as the knowledge source. And there are other works like using the web as a knowledge source. It's just searching web search engines to try to retrieve relevant documents. And of course, there are already quite a few fact-checking websites out there, like Snopes, for example, and people also try to use information from these fact-checking websites to as a knowledge source to verify claims. So these are some commonly used textual evidence knowledge sources. So how do we retrieve, given a document corpus that you have that you've decided you're going to use, what do you do to retrieve the information? Well, one very standard thing is just do standard IR. You can just index your document collection and then just build a query based on your claim, and then try to use standard IR based on TF-IDF or BM25, whatever flavor you like, to retrieve relevant documents or relevant sentences. Nowadays, though, people try to do something a little bit more fancy using things like what we call dense retrievers, which are basically neural network-based retrievers. And conceptually, they're not very difficult to understand. In these dense retriever, the most representative one in this paper. So what they do is first encode the query and your document, each of the documents using BERT, and these are separate encoding. So the query and the document is there's not joint encoding; they're encoded separately, so that your document collection can be pre-encoded before you even receive any query. And of course, the query in this case is the claim. And then once you have encoded the query and the documents, then computing the distance between the query and the document is straightforward. You can use something like cosine similarity. The biggest question, of course, is how do you train such these sort of bioencoders to retrieve documents, right? What people have done is to train them on question-answer data sets, because in question-answer data sets you have a question and the right answer, so you have these paired information. And so what they do here is, basically use BERT to encode these question and these answers, and then try to, train it using an objective such that it would learn representations that produce high similarity between real question-answer pairs versus, a question and a randomly sampled answer pair. So fairly straightforward. And it turns out to work surprisingly well. You train these dense retrievers on QA data sets, even though it's not potentially not in the same domain of the task that you're doing for rumor detection, for example, or fact checking. It turns out to work reasonably well. And so there's a whole slew of papers since then extending these sort of dense retrievers, making them more efficient. For example, turning the encoding into binary codes, for example, and whatnot. So once you retrieve your evidence documents or sentences, if you want to further improve the precision, you can use yet another model to re-rank your evidence, right? So since in these papers, they build a stance detection, they try to understand what's the stance relation, if there's any stance relation at all between an evidence, a sentence, and a claim. If you don't detect any stance sort of relation, like if it's neutral, then you might want to rank it a bit lower. And so you put things that are supported or contradiction or entailment a little bit higher. So you can improve the precision of your retrieval a little bit better. Another way to do this is by looking at using structured knowledge instead of textual knowledge. And so what that means is that instead of relying on some sort of document collection, you would use a knowledge base like DBpedia, for example. And in this case, typically the claim is no longer framed in just natural language, but expressed in a triple. And the aim then is to try to find paths in the knowledge base that support a particular claim. So here I'm going to use an example of a publication to illustrate how they do this. So given an example of a claim, so here the claim is expressed in triple, Berkshire Hathaway, key person, Warren Buffett. And so the claim is basically trying to check whether Warren Buffett is the key person in Berkshire Hathaway. And given some sort of knowledge base, what they do here is they try to find a lot of paths between the head to the tail entity, from the Berkshire Hathaway to the Warren Buffett. And here, given the knowledge base, it found lots of links, lots of paths that goes from the head to the tail. And you will notice also that the edges also sort of have a thickness to it, have a variable thickness to it. And that denotes basically the strength, how likely that link is going to be a useful link basically to this particular claim. And so, key person, a link that shares exactly the same word as the key person in the claim, you would give higher weights and whatnot. And ultimately what they do here is, after you find all these different paths, a claim is more likely to be supported by the knowledge base if it has lots of paths, and also the paths has strong weights. So that's sort of the gist of it. Now, that's fairly intuitive, and you can imagine developing all sorts of algorithms to try to, detect these sort of links between the head and the tail entity and all that. But there's some drawbacks with such approaches. The one really obvious one is, of course, general domain knowledge base is never going to be complete. It's very possible that you will find that there is a claim that's actually truthful, but it just doesn't have any paths that's attested in the knowledge base. Not because it's not true, but simply because your knowledge base is incomplete. So that's something that people try to solve by just making your knowledge base as complete as possible. But more importantly, in my opinion, it's not just that. Thinking that you can frame, the idea that you can frame claims in just a triple is not really realistic. In reality, if you look at real claims that have misinformation, they're usually a little bit more complex than just involving two entities with one relation. And just thinking about our example that we have previously, sea level rising is not accelerating. That doesn't really have any relationship between two entities. In fact, it's about a claim about a predicate. So the idea of trying to force a claim and frame it in triple is somewhat artificial, and so you don't see it nowadays a lot in people trying to use this sort of approach to try to tackle real claims that are sort of misleading. Okay, so I just gave a whirlwind tour of evidence retrieval. You will see very similar style in the rest of the talk. I'm going to be fairly brief on the methods and whatnot. Next, we're going to move on to verdict prediction, which is the last part after you've searched through and collected all these evidence. How do you make a prediction about the verdict of the claim? In terms of the labels for the verdict, you know, you can be something very simple like just binary, true or false. Nowadays, nowadays we tend to see data sets with more sort of a spectrum on the sort of truthfulness, from like true, mostly false to false. And this is closer to really how journalists define sort of the truthful spectrum rather than a binary. It's something a little bit, you know, on the more gradient side. Another way to try to make your verdict prediction is, rather than saying this is a claim is true or false, instead predict whether a claim is supported or refuted by your evidence passages, or not enough information. If you can't, if based on the evidence you don't have enough information to make a conclusion. This is somewhat a little bit more neutral in the sense that with you know, the older works where you try to claim something is true or false or mostly true and whatnot, you are basically assuming that the evidence that you retrieve is credible, it's truthful in the first place. Because if you have retrieved something that is not credible, if your evidence passage is not credible in the first place, then whatever verdict prediction you make is not likely to reflect the true value. With refute and support, it's a little bit more narrow. It's not claiming that whether a claim is really truthful or not. It's just saying that given the evidence we have, that is supported by the evidence, or that is refuted by the evidence. And so it's sort of basically abstracted away the issue, trying to deal with the problem of whether your evidence passages is credible or not in the first place, which I think is you know, one of the harder problems when it comes to fact-checking, and one of the barriers to truly building automated fact-checking, that we don't really have an easy way to try to measure the credibility of your sources easily. Because if you can, then really you kind of solve the problem really, because in a way, automated fact-checking is about measuring the credibility of the claim in the first place. So it's almost like a recursive problem. Anyway, given that you have these, what are some of the methods that you can use to do verdict prediction? Verdict prediction can be sort of seen as a form of a textual entailment task, or nowadays called the natural language inference task, NLI, where, you know, given a claim sea level rise is not accelerating, and then given a evidence passage like in red, Antarctica ice melt has accelerated by 280% in the last 4 decades. The question we want to ask is whether this evidence passage entails this claim. In this case, it doesn't, of course. But the complication, of course, we don't usually just have one piece of evidence. Usually when you do retrieval, evidence retrieval, you have, you know, you try to search a few more and you have multiple pieces of evidence. One really dumb way of doing things is, of course, just to concatenate all your evidence passages together into one long input string and then just try to do the entailment. But of course, that's a very naive way of doing things. And so people have come up with slightly more smarter way to try to reason between these multiple evidences. And how they do this is by building some sort of graph models to do reasoning. And here I'm going to use an example to sort of motivate why you might want to do something a little bit smarter than just concatenating all your evidences together. For example, here we have a claim that says the Rodney King riots took place in the most populous county in the USA. And then you have two evidence. The first evidence say that Rodney King riots took place in Los Angeles County. And then the second evidence, it says the Los Angeles County is the most populous county in the USA. So therefore, if you follow the sort of the link between the evidence, the first two evidences, then it shouldn't be hard to see that the Rodney King riots did take place in the most populous county in the USA. But you would have to actually do a little bit sort of a smarter aggregation of information between the two passages. If you just concatenate them all together, you know, we don't really know if they're going to be able to do do an entailment directly. So how do they do this? How do they build graphs over, you know, to try to reason this? It's kind of cute how they do it. They first basically use a semantic role labeler, SRL parser, to parse all these passages, and then try to construct SRL graphs, semantic role label graphs, based on the verbs. So this is an example of you know, the SRL graph. So given each piece of evidence, they're going to use the SRL parser that's going to give you, you know, the semantic roles of the words in the text. So for example, the SRL graph being built from the verb known is the graph is that graph that you can see in the top left side. Where you can see known is connected to two arguments, and also have an adverbial phrase and whatnot. And again, you can build the same thing for same SRL graph occurred and same SRL graph is. And once you've done that, you have basically three disjointed graphs, right? So in order to connect these three disjointed graphs, what they do is to try to connect nodes that are lexically very similar, that lexically has a very high overlap. And very simple, so you can see that, the 1992 Los Angeles riots is sort of connected to Los Angeles County in the bottom SRL graph because there's some lexical overlap. And so once you've done that, then you have a graph that's fully connected between all these disjointed SRL graphs. And this similar nodes is defined using just lexical overlap. You can do something a little more complicated, but what they did is just lexical overlap, which is reasonable. The second step, of course, is to try then process this SRL graph, from the claim and the evidence, trying to predict the veracity ultimately. And so this is sort of what they do. The first thing they do is, take the claim and the evidence passages and concatenate all of them together, and then process them with a pre-trained sequence model like XLNet in this case. And once you've done that, then you have all these contextualized embeddings for all the different subwords in the claim and the sentence. So that part is very straightforward. And then the next thing they want to do is they build these SRL graphs based on the claim and the evidence passages, right? But they do it separately. So you can see you have basically two sets of SRL graphs. The top set corresponds to basically SRL graph built using the claim, so it's a claim graph. And then the bottom graph is SRL graph based built using the evidence passages. So it's the evidence graph basically. And once you build these two graphs, they use graph convolution network to basically process these graphs. But how they initialize the nodes, the individual nodes in the graph, like the nodes of the Rodney King riots or the take place node, how they get the initial node is by just taking the average XLNet output vectors, basically. Because the XLNet output vectors only give you words or subwords, right? Whereas the nodes in these graphs, they are phrases usually. And so you need to somehow aggregate the contextual embeddings. And they just do an average. Again, very simple, nothing complicated. What they do, the last bit, I guess, is the most complicated part is the last bit where, given the evidence graph and given the claim graph, what they want to do is to try to contextualize the node in the claim graph a little bit more using the nodes in the evidence graph, basically. And so this is where they do some sort of graph attention from the claim nodes to the evidence node, one by one at a time. And the idea is really just like self-attention. It's using key query value attention. So given after you process the claim graph using your graph convolution network, you're going to get some node embedding for each of the nodes, right? Like the node for take place, Rodney King riots, and whatnot. What they want to do now is contextualize, say, take place further using the evidence graph even more. And so what they do is basically trying to get the take place node, attend to all the nodes in the evidence graph, and then try to weight each of the node in the evidence graph. And how you do the weighting is by using just key query comparison. So this is just cross attention basically. And once you have that, you can build a contextualized representation of take place, contextualized in the evidence nodes. And the final graph representation is simply just taking the mean pool of all the nodes in your claim graph. But because your claim graph also have two representation, right? The before you do the contextualization and after you do the contextualization. So you have H and H prime. They aggregate it by just concatenating them together. And once you concatenate them, then you can just do a mean pool of all the nodes, the three nodes, for example, in the claim graph to give you a full graph representation. And then you can take the full graph representation and then make a prediction and whatnot. So that's what they do. And they found that, yeah, it works quite well, particularly for evidences that require, a bit more reasoning, that you need to aggregate information across evidences. And there's no surprise compared to just concatenating, all your evidence passages together. Okay, so that sort of summarizes all I want to talk for some of the methodologies for evidence retrieval and verdict prediction. The last part I want to talk is about automated fact checking is the data sets. What are some of the data sets that we have for automated fact checking? Because data sets is everything that drives us what we can do and cannot do. So it's really important that you know what are some of the data sets that we have out there. So this survey paper from Guo did a phenomenal job trying to compile all these different data sets for automated fact checking, from natural claims to synthetic claims. Natural claims are basically claims that are real claims that contain misinformation out in the wild that you can collect. Synthetic claims are basically claims that are being created for the task, and so they might, in terms of the language and the style, be a little bit different to what you would see in the wild. There are advantages of synthetic claim, which you'll see in a little bit. Well, the obvious one is that you can generate lots of data with synthetic claims. But let's start with the natural claim first. Lots of different natural claims data set. Generally, you can see it's broken down into 3 types of data set. The one where the input is a statement or an answer or an article. The statement is basically a claim where it's just a sentence or a short sentence, and that's the most common one. Answer is usually drawn from a QA data sets. Article is basically where your claim is a news article, so it's a lot longer than just a single statement. Nowadays, we generally don't do so much with the answer or the article type of input, and mostly focus on the input, where the input is just a single statement, because it's a lot easier to fact check a single statement. It kind of is very difficult to try to fact check, or it doesn't even make sense sometimes to fact check an article, a full article, because a full article can have many different claims in the article. And so when you say an article is is right or wrong, it doesn't really tell you which part is right. It could be a mixture of correct statements and incorrect statements within an article. So nowadays, usually we work with at the statement level, which is a single claim. Perhaps of note here in terms of the natural claims dataset here is Multi-FC, Augustine 2019. This is one of the larger fact-checking dataset, where basically what they do is they scrape a number of fact-checking websites, and then I think something like 20 or 30 fact-checking websites, and then put them all together into one single data set. They also provide the evidence, and the evidence are basically just web search documents based on the claim. The little downside of this data set is that you can see the verdict classes comes with a range from 2 to 27, and that's because different fact-checking websites have different categories for the verdict, and they didn't try to basically aggregate, try to collapse them. They just left them as they were in the original website. So depending on the source, you have actually different classes or categories to deal with for your verdict. Another interesting one is XFACT, one of the newest one. This is a multilingual data set. You can see most of the data sets focus on just English. This is one of the rare few data sets that actually has multilingual claims. So let's look at artificial claims next. Again, for artificial claims, it comes with 3 types of data sets. Data sets where the input is a triple, so that would use a structured knowledge bases, or comes in passage, which is longer, or comes in statement, which is a single sort of line sort of thing. The one data set that is worth mentioning here is the fever data set that you may have heard of. If you do anything to do with misinformation detection or fact checking, you probably would have heard of the fever data set. The fever data set is of note here because it's the first data set that created this really large scale claims data set that has 180,000 input claims, basically. That sort of really kickstarted this whole automated fact checking and allowing people to build deep neural networks and whatnot. And this is an artificial, it's important to note that this is, like, the claims are artificial in that the claims are generated, mutated based on on Wikipedia sentences, basically. And then afterwards, because the claim is sort of generated from Wikipedia sentences in the first place, the knowledge base they use is basically Wikipedia. And very likely you can use Wikipedia to verify the claim that you've created. And since then, it sort of triggered a number of data sets. They're all Wikipedia inspired. So you can see, if you look at what happens after fever, all of them are basically using Wikipedia as the knowledge source. And all of them comes with different flavors and enhancement. Like vitamin C tries to use a revision history so that you can have evidence passages that are so minimally contrastive. They differ minimally, but they're actually contrastive of each other, which makes the task a little bit more difficult. So anyway, these are the artificial claims data set. You'll no doubt notice that they are much larger than the natural claims data set for a reason. I guess the one thing that I want to talk about here, is it's very nice that we have these large data sets. People created these fever data sets, and it really enabled the development of these large neural models, deep learning models that we built, right, for doing automated fact checking. But and it inspired a whole new wave of new fact-checking data sets and whatnot. But I guess, to me, it's not really clear the applicability of these models that you've built using these Wikipedia-based synthetic data sets, the applicability of these fact-checking models to fact-checking real-world claims, because in terms of it's very different, these synthetic claims compared to real-world claims. In terms of the complexity of the language is very different, stylistically is very different, topically is very different. So how much you can adapt these big models that you've trained on synthetic data to real-world data, it's really hard. It's really hard to say. And so you really want to think about whether it's meaningful, basically, to build these models based on the synthetic data sets. Because if it can't be applied to do anything real to solve problems, then what's the point of doing it? So I spent way too much time that I like on automated fact checking. The second part that I'd like to cover is rumor detection, which is, if you remember, if you're still staying with me, is the second task that that is being framed as a part of misinformation detection. So I briefly talked about rumor detection earlier. In rumor detection, what we want to do is try to identify and verify stories on social media. So this example that you see there, where someone made a claim about a story and triggered lots of conversation, and what we want to do is check whether this original post is rumor or not. The main difference between rumor detection and automated fact checking is the signal you use for detection. In rumor detection, you are relying on social features for detection. So you're not gonna go out and find external knowledge, sources to try to verify a claim like in automated fact checking, but you're gonna look at these social features that you have, because this post is being posted on social media. And the things that you're going to look at, the obvious things, the comments and the reactions of people towards the original post, and the patterns of spread, how quickly, how slowly, how the sort of the shape of the spread. So these are the features that generally we use in rumor detection to try to detect rumors. And in terms of the verdict classes, there are also, there are few variation. You can do something binary that just detects whether something is a rumor versus non-rumor, or you can go down and predict the veracity, the truthfulness itself, and predict whether this particular story is truthful or not, or it's fake, or it's unverified. So depending on the data sets, you're going to see some variation here. And so just like the automated fact-checking section, I'm going to talk about methods first, some of the representative methods in the space, and then come back and look at some of the data sets that we have in rumor detection. So early work, sort of pre-neural network, what people would do is, as you imagine, back in the good old days of SVM, you would try to train these classical models using hand-engineered features, right, from either the post content, the user profile, or the propagation pattern. So here's a table I extracted from this Ma 2015 paper, where you can see there are three types of features, hand-engineered features. The first type is content-based features, looking at, say, the LDA topic distribution, looking at the number of question marks and and whatnot. Then you have user-based features where you look at the, say, the Twitter user profile, whether it provides a personal description, whether it provides a personal picture and whatnot. And then you have the diffusion, which is the propagation pattern, number of retweets, number of comments for a particular post and whatnot. So these are hand-engineered features, and that's what people used to do before, pre-neural network. In this particular data set that they use, a story that they're trying to detect whether it's a rumor or not is actually a collection of tweets related to a topic. So a topic could be like, say, Hillary Clinton announces for 2016 campaign for president, and given this topic, they would then search a number of tweets that are associated with this topic and then use that as the story. We don't really do that very often. We don't do that so much nowadays. As you'll see in the next few slides for newer work, generally speaking, a story nowadays is one tweet, basically. And people look at the conversation that are spawned from the tweet to try to detect rumors. So we don't have this set of tweets, based on a particular topic. We don't do that as much nowadays. So the next one tries to, so this is, during the this deep learning has started already, people started exploring recursive networks to try to model the conversation triggered by a particular tweet. If you're old enough, you probably heard of recursive networks. Recursive networks were originally proposed to try to process basically sentences, but using the sort of the syntax structure. So rather than process your things, your sentence left to right, you try to process it based on the syntax structure. And it was really cool when it first came out, and so sort of inspired the piece of work they do here. What they do here is that given a tweet, which may be misleading, the tweet has generated a lot of conversation, and the conversation has a tree-like structure, right? Because you have all these reply to sort of relation. What they do here is then use recursive network to sort of build the representation either bottom up, processing from the leaf all the way to the root, or top down, processing starting from the top all the way to the leaf node. I'm not going to step through in lots of details, but the idea is really simple. When the bottom up in the bottom up recursive network approach, what they do is basically, given a particular node, like say x2, in order to build a new representation for x2, you need to aggregate the children, right? The x3 and x4. And what they do is, they just mean pull x3 and x4 first, then afterwards combine x2 and the mean pull of x3 and x4 in a GRU, basically. And you use GR, and you can again gonna do the same thing when you try to build a new representation for R from R to R prime, basically. One thing I would mention though is that the original node, original representation for each of these x1, x2, x3 is just TF IDF embedding of the tweet, basically. So very simple. So that's bottom up. Top down works in the reverse way, where basically you want to build a new representation, you would take your current representation with the parent representation and then combine it using GRU, and then you're gonna keep doing it from top to bottom. And then you can build representation from these two approaches, from these two directions, and then you can concatenate them, and then afterwards get it to make a prediction. The idea why you want to have these top-down and bottom-up recursive networks is that you process the information very differently. For the top-down, you would process the original source post first, and then analyze how the comments sort of spread. And then the bottom-up, you would actually look at the comments first, and then see how it eventually merge and talk about how it's related to the source post. So just two different ways to try to process your conversation, basically. Since then, we have pre-trained language models like BERT and whatnot, and so people have started using these sort of pre-trained models to try to model conversation, of course. But in this case, you would model the conversation as a chain instead of in its tree structure, because these BERT models are sequence processing models. They don't inherently take structure of the conversation. So what people do in this case is say concatenate the original post with all the contents into one long string, and then you can fine-tune a BERT model to predict the rumor class. The up and the downside is that with such an approach you would capture the order of appearance of those comments because you order them based on the order of based on the timestamp, but then you won't capture the reply to structure. You basically throw them away and just assume everything is a linear chain. The authors also try to fine-tune BERT, first using stance prediction before rumor detection, and saw some minor benefits. But you don't have to do it if you don't want to. But it's not surprising that doing a bit of stance prediction training before you do rumor detection gives you benefits too, because of course stance detection is a very related task. Something a bit more advanced and something a bit more recent, and something that we have done ourselves, is to try to be a little bit more holistic about the information that we try to use. And here in this piece of work, we try to combine both user networks and comment networks when we try to predict the rumor. And the core idea, of course, is the user network would capture who engages with the story, and the comment network would capture how they react to it. So in the previous few slides, you saw all these different methods, like using BERT or recursive network, and then these methods capture the how they react to it side, but they didn't really capture who engages with the story. They didn't really capture the user network, and that's something that we want to do here. And perhaps also important to mention is that how we capture the comment network here is a little bit different to the previous approaches. Here we try to use a combination of BERT and graph networks to model the comment network, and you're going to see a little bit how we do this. So an illustration of the overall architecture of Duck, how we do this is given a conversation, given a source tweet, and that triggered a lot of conversation, including retweets. So you can see, if you look at the left picture, if you look at the left square, some of the comments are comments with the speech bubble, and some of them are actually just retweets. So there are no actual textual content, but they help propagate. These users help propagate the source post. So how we model this is that we have three different ways to model two things. The first thing we built is we built a user tree, which is based on all the users who engage in the story, whether by retweeting or commenting on the post. We would first build a user tree based on that, and then use a graph attention network to try to basically encode this graph. The second way, the one in the middle, is where we do something like what you saw in the BERT model in a few slides ago, where we treat the comment as a chain. And so we order all the comment as just in the order of the appearance, and then use a BERT model or any sort of transformer model to try to process the chain. And then the last part, the comment tree part, this is where we do something a little bit more creative, where, given the conversation tree, and here we don't include the retweet because the retweet doesn't have any text associated with a retweet. What we do here is we first basically try to connect or try to concatenate the parent text with the child text, and then use BERT to process the parent-child post first before we use graph attention networks to process the graph. I'm going to talk about why we do this in a bit, because what I'm going to do next is just quickly talk about these three different ways of modeling the interaction. So I'm going to start with the easiest one, which is comment chain. So in comment chain, we just try to model the comments as a stream. The most straightforward is just concatenate everything together and use BERT, right? And this is what we call a one-tier transformer. You can also use longformer to process the sequence, which allows you to basically feed in more comments, because BERT has a rather short maximum sequence length. Longformer has a much longer maximum sequence length, and so allow us to basically pretty much take in all the comments that we have, and we don't need to truncate any late comments. So longformer means that you're going to lose less information, and longformer, why it's able to have a longer sequence, maximum sequence limit, is because it uses sparse attention. Or you can also do something a little bit cuter, like a two-tier transformer, which also allows you to capture all the comments you have by having sort of two levels of processing, where the first level is just still the BERT, where you process the concatenated string, and then the second level would take in the CLS vector from the first level BERT, and then try to run another sequence processing transformer on the second level. And so this allows you to basically capture all the posts that you have in the stream. The second one that I'm going to talk about is the comment tree, where here we use a combination of BERT and also graph attention networks. So the comment tree would model the conversation structure, and we would use both pre-trained language models and graph. And the key idea here is that we would use BERT to process a child and parent post here. And the reason why we want to do this, rather than just using BERT to process a post independently, like each of the posts independently, and then use a graph to process them, is that there's a lot of nuances, in terms of the relationship between the parent and the child post. If you just use BERT to process each of these posts individually, and then you use graph to encode the graph afterwards, you may lose a lot of information because the graph is going to see basically just an encoding between posts. You're going to see just a vector between the two posts. And so it may not be able to capture, say, the nuanced relationship between a parent and child because you've done compression already. Whereas if you use BERT to process a parent and child first together by concatenating them together, all the self-attention between the words is going to be able to do finer grained, deeper analysis between the parent and the child posts. And so this is the reason why we use BERT to process a pair of posts instead of just individually. And once you use BERT to process a pair of posts, then you can still use the same graph networks to try to basically capture the conversation structure. So in terms of illustration, it pretty much looks something like this, where the original graph you have, which is on the left-hand side, we would first basically concatenate the parent post with each of the child posts, the text. So you can see it sort of like each node has sort of two parts, the parent post and the child post. The root node doesn't have a parent post, so we just concatenate with itself, basically. And then afterwards, each node would be processed by BERT first, and then you extract the CLS representation. And then afterwards, you can feed it to a graph attention networks, and then you can build a representation for the graph. And then once you build a representation for all the nodes, then you can do some sort of aggregation like mean pooling or max pooling or whatever to give you a vector in the end that represents the graph. The user tree conceptually is very simple. So again, we just use graph attention networks to model the user network. The user network is a little bit different to the conversation tree because it includes also retweeting user. But either way, the idea is it's the same, right? Once you have the tree structure, you can just use any sort of graph models to try to process the tree. Here we use graph attention networks. The key question really is how do you initialize each of the user node here. And you can do something really simple where you just randomly initialize each of your user node and then just let the graph to figure out how to do the coding. You can be a little bit smarter. You initialize each of your node in the graph using user profile information, like say the username, the user description, and whatnot. Or you can do something even smarter than that, where you try to incorporate the social network or the peer network of each of the user that we have there. It will sound a little bit convoluted, but what we do here first is, we first look at all the users in the training data. So you will basically looking away from just each of the conversation now, but we're gonna collect all the users in the training data, and then connect all these users based on their follow relationship between all these different users, and then use an unsupervised graph encoder, in this case a variational autograph encoder, to try to build a representation for all the users first. Okay, and we also initialize the embedding for this variational graph encoder using the user profile information. So it also embeds a little bit of the user profile information. But once you've done that, you have built basically some user embedding for all these users based on their peer network. Once you have that, then we use that to initialize this graph attention networks for each of the user network that you have for a particular conversation. So hopefully hopefully you parse that. But some of the really broad findings that we find is that in terms of comment chain, it turns out the two-tier transformer works quite well. Long former, in fact, didn't work very well. For the comment tree, we found that it was very important to use BERT to process the parent and child posts. If you use BERT to only process each post at a time, you're going to find quite a bit of a performance dip. For the user tree, we find that incorporating the social relation was very, very important. If you only use surface features like just the user profile information, you're not going to get as much gain as incorporating the social relations. And again, that's very intuitive. Who you associate with, who your peers are, tells a lot about you, really. So it's no surprise that using that information tells you a bit, gives you a bit more information. And so if you combine all these three different models together, we found that it gives a create a new state of the art for multiple data sets across different languages for rumor detection, which is great. So so that's nice. So I've given you sort of a quick survey of sort of the modeling approach for rumor detection, from sort of the early approach to sort of something a little bit more modern and new. The last part, I'm just going to talk about the data sets that we have in rumor detection. So in rumor detection, we don't have as many data sets as automated fact checking. So you can see, and a lot of these rumor detection data sets are mostly based on Twitter, based on tweets. We also see some Weibo, but the most data sets are based on tweets, and that's why they're in English. In terms of the input size, generally they range from a few thousand claims. COVID is something a bit more notable in terms of size. And most of them provides you some sort of comment IDs based on the source post. Although some datasets don't give you the comment IDs, but give you the comments instead. And so it's a little bit more difficult to get metadata if you sometimes if they don't provide it. But you can see in this case, when they don't give you the comment ID, they give you the metadata of the source post. In terms of the verdict classes, again, you kind of see a variation from like 4 classes to just true and false and whatnot. So these are some representative rumor detection datasets. Oh, and I should mention, all credits to Lin, who you might have already seen this morning, who actually collected all these statistics. Okay, I don't have a lot of time left. I'll try to spend around 5-10 minutes to talk about what I see sort of some of the important challenges and some of the avenues for future direction in this space. One thing that's, of course, we see it everywhere, not just in misinformation detection, is interpretability. It's becoming more and more important that we need to try to explain the model decision. And particularly for misinformation detection, this is really obvious why it's important. Because if you have, a automatic detection system that classifies a story as false, it's never going to be very persuasive in real applications, because you kind of need to explain also why this particular story is false. And if you look at how journalists, when they fact check articles, they do that, right? So this is from Climate Feedback, where they look at all these different climate change claims and then try to basically fact check them whether they're real or not. And so here you have a particular claim. You can see the verdict, concluded by the journalist is inaccurate. But beyond that, if you look at the bottom, you see all these details sort of try to justify why this particular claim is inaccurate. So it will talk about, in detail, what are some of the lines that contradict the claim. And there's even a key takeaway that summarizes, again, more information about what is wrong about the claim. So there's a lot of explanation given, to try to convince people why things are real or fake. And so we kind of need to do that now with automated fact checking or rumor detection. But this is going to be hard, right? Because most of the models that we build, they are deep learning models that are inherently not interpretable, and so what people have tried to do to try to provide some justification is by examining the attention weights to try to highlight important words in the evidence passages or in the user features or in the comments, words that led to the decision. Now, you can argue how interpretable is that, but even if you believe this is looking at attention is interpretable, it's still actually really problematic, because people have found that basically attention is not explanation. Basically, if you try to remove words that have high attention, it turns out that it doesn't really have much effect to the decision, the final decision. And so really showing that attention is not explanation, and the attention that you see is not really faithful to the model decision. Another way where people try to produce some sort of justification to your veracity prediction is by framing justification production as a generation task. And here I'm going to do some shameless self-advertisement, where Ray is going to present a paper on this in the next few days, where he looks at trying to generate some sort of justification for climate change claims, basically. So it is complete framed as a generation task, as a summary task, as a summarization task. But of course, by training your models to try to generate explanation together, say together with your veracity prediction, you still have the faithfulness problem, right? Where your generated justification may not always explain the prediction. Where we've seen cases where it predicts something as, say, refute, but then if you read the generated justification, it kind of contradicts it. It doesn't happen very often, but it can. And again, just highlighting that basically the model does the justification that it generates isn't always faithful to the prediction. So how do we? So what are some better ways to find justification? One idea that I think has a lot of sort of traction is potentially looking at causal inference. There's more and more works looking at, say, causal models like causal mediation analysis to try to basically you look at what are some of the structure in your model that are causally implicated with the decision process. So you can actually identify neurons that has a causal sort of impact to the decision. And to me, that sounds like really good, because you're looking at something that's actually causal rather than just correlation. So that could be a future direction that I see lots of potential. Multimodality, of course, the information to try to detect misinformation. There's all sorts of modality, from tables to images to videos and whatnot, beyond just text, right? But because we're an NLP community, a lot of times, a lot of the information we use is largely focusing on text. And while that's good for a start, I think it's important that you have to see a little bit broader, that if you have information beyond text, you should use them. And most of the data sets, of course, provide only text as evidence, but there are some exceptions that we start to see. For example, the feverous data sets that actually includes tables as evidence as well. And you can imagine tables are probably quite informative, because if you look at scientific publications, lots of information is being summarized in tables. And so using a bit of these table information could be very useful. And if you're working with rumor detection and you have tweet IDs and whatnot, it's actually not really hard to even recover the images that you have in the tweet, because you have those information. That's it. The caveat is that sometimes you may find that lots of links have expired and you can't recover it. But you'll still be able to find a lot of these images, I think, from experience. And images are really powerful. Memes are very powerful, and incorporating these images as part of your processing, it could give you a lot of gain. The last part, another one is multilinguality. We've seen some automated fact-checking data sets and some rumor detection data sets. You can see most of them focus on English. But we already know that there are people out there who try to craft misinformation targeting a particular linguistic community, and here are some examples that you can see. And so, in our work, we try to explore using self-training to try to zero-shot transfer a monolingual detection system to other languages, and sort of found, pretty positive results. And the idea is really simple. You start with a multilingual pre-trained model, and then you fine-tune this multilingual pre-trained model on, say, English rumor detection, right? Then afterwards, you use this fine-tuned model to basically predict, zero-shot predict rumor data set in another language, basically. So creating all these silver labels. And then afterwards, you can just keep doing this, take the silver labels and continue fine-tune the multilingual model on the new language, basically. And then, you can do this iteratively over multiple steps to slowly refine your model. And we found it turns out to work pretty well. But sort of the drawback that I see with this is that it works very well when you try to adapt one monolingual system into a bilingual detection system, but it won't really scale for many languages because of the curse of multilinguality problem, which is the phenomena where you see a performance degradation when you adapt a fixed capacity model to many different languages. And one very obvious avenue I can see here is looking into multilingual pre-trained models that actually use language-specific adapters, where your pre-trained language models no longer have fixed capacity. As you sort of scale it for more languages, you actually add in these new adapters that have new parameters for these new languages. So this way, it sort of tackles the curse of the phenomena of the curse of multilinguality problem, and lots of exciting things to try there. Lastly, I'm almost finished. I'm really sorry I'm over time. is I'm just going to very briefly talk about disinformation versus misinformation. So we've already seen Jenny define misinformation, which is sort of a general term that refers to any sort of false and inaccurate information. Disinformation, on the other hand, is a particular type of misinformation that's created deliberately to deceive. So it's a lot more. It's designed to be harmful and create a negative impact. Most of the time, in the research, you won't see people try to distinguish misinformation versus disinformation, because really it's very hard to determine intent. It's very hard to tell, the person who created a post, whether they created it with, a malicious intent or not, right? So it's fair enough. But it's perhaps worthwhile to note that, there's this really nice data set that Twitter has released that collects a lot of users that's been suspected in engaging in mass influence campaigns on Twitter, basically. And it's a very rich data set that has over more than 10 campaigns from different countries and different languages. And here's a summary. We've processed the data a little bit, and here's some of the summary of of these different campaigns with the hashtags and whatnot. So you can see they all have different goals in these mass influence campaigns. And I feel like this is almost like a gold mine that that is waiting to be extracted. And I start to see more papers using this this information operations data set to sort of identify misinformation, detect disinformation and whatnot. But the NLP community hasn't really caught on with this data set, and people are still using sort of the rumor detection data set and whatnot. So check it out if you're looking in this space. I think this is a really, really cool data set, because it really allows us to finally distinguish between misinformation versus disinformation. Okay, I'm gonna summarize now. We've talked a lot about misinformation detection today, how it's framed as an automated fact-checking task or as a rumor detection task, which we use very different signal to try to detect the veracity or check the veracity of a piece of information. The last thing I would point you to, if you're looking for good survey papers on this topic, I would definitely check out these two survey papers. The first survey paper is mostly sort of written in the perspective of automated fact-checking. It's a tackle survey paper, very broad coverage, a very nice way to introduce people to automated fact-checking. It doesn't do a very good justice for rumor detection, though, which is why we have the second paper, which is really focused on rumor detection. It's a little bit old, this paper, so in terms of the methodology, it's since moved on quite a bit from there, but still, there's lots of interesting resource, the conception of rumors and whatnot, really good insights that you can get if you're working on rumor detection. So two papers that I would recommend you, if you're looking for survey papers. And that's it for the references. These slides are up on the tutorial, ALTA tutorial website. So if you want to check out the references, you can download the slides and whatnot from the ALTA tutorial website. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. And yeah, thanks for both presenters so far for very interesting sessions. But the presenters have indicated they would like to take some questions before we go for afternoon tea, which is out there already. So I think we can have a few questions. Does anyone have anything here in the room, or otherwise on the chat? I don't believe I've seen anything.
Hi, Jehan. This is Gisela.
Hey.
I would like to ask you. You were describing in the evidence retriever that there is this methodology to retrieve, like to classify whether a piece of evidence is true or not by concatenating the article and the claim. Then I wanted to understand a little bit deeper, is this concatenating the whole article, or how are they doing this?
Not quite. I maybe didn't make myself very clear. So the entailment relationship that you're trying to measure is from the evidence to the claim, right? And when I say concatenation is the case where you have, say, 4 pieces of evidence, like 4 evidence passages, you concatenate them all together, and then that's your hypothesis basically, and then the entailment is trying to see whether this 4 pieces of evidence entail the claim that you have there. Sorry, I can't hear you, Gisela.
Sorry, that's evidence. That's evidence. That's not evidence retrieval, isn't it? I was thinking about you were mentioning classifying whether a piece of article has evidence for a claim.
Which part? No, we don't quite do that. As in, we don't really. The evidence retrieval just retrieve the evidence. We don't classify whether a news article.
So that means that it would be something like Oracle, where the evidence was already retrieved, and you are classifying whether a claim is supported or rejected.
Oh, you mean the stance detection part where we try to re-rank the evidence? Is that the part that you're?
It wasn't the evidence.
Let me just get my
part, so
slide. Sorry, I think it's here. Are you talking about the last point?
I'm talking about encoding the query and documents using BERT.
Okay.
That one. So
you've already. So at that point, you just have your document collection and your query, and then you just encode each thing separately, like not jointly.
And then how do you retrieve the evidence?
Oh, yeah. Once you train the model, and then you can just retrieve it using cosine similarity. So you literally, after you do the encoding, you would take the claim, which is you have a claim vector, you would cosine similarity with all the document that you have, and then see which one has the highest cosine similarity.
And then you would retrieve the whole document.
You would retrieve the whole document first, but depends on how you tokenize your documents, because you can tokenize your documents into sentences already, and then build these vectors for evidence in terms of sentences first too, right? So you can retrieve as document, and then further on try to find the sentences within the document too. It's up to you how you want to tokenize, either as a one-step or a two-step process.
I see. Okay, thank you. Just a little bit. The BERT thing is truncating at 512 tokens, right?
I believe so. You have to. I mean, you never get away with the maximum sequence. Yeah.
Hey, anyone else got a question?
Hi, great talk. Thanks very much. My name is Victor Stamatescu. I'm from DSTG. I'm not from this area. I'm wondering if you could go to the slide summarizing rumor data sets.
Okay. Rumor data set, this one?
Thanks, yes. So in looking at the verdict column, I see different, it sort of implies a different definition for what a rumor is. So how do you define a rumor? A rumor could be true, right?
It's a mess, I would say. Basically, the rumor, it's sort of really not really rumor, because a rumor is supposed to be something that's unverified when someone first said it, right? But if you look at these data sets, how they create these data sets is that they go to a fact-checking website, and they know already this information has been fact-checked, whether it be true or not true, and then you looking at those claims, and then basically searching Twitter for claims or posts that's related to that particular claim. So really, if you think about how they build these data sets, it's not really rumor. It's already based on whatever claim that has been fact-checked or not. So I wouldn't basically think very hard about the definition of rumor for these data sets that's been created by computer scientists, because they have their own definition. They're not really real rumors that are unverified during the conception, basically. If that makes sense, I hope yeah.
I guess that means that the rumor detection models are trained for different tasks.
You can say that. You can say that, because the definition of rumor itself is all very different, and most people are interested in the modeling, right? And they don't really care about what is the real definition of the rumor data set. They just want to have a data set that's labeled, and they train models for it, and that's what happened. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for our presenters? So you can see that one, Dehan, in the chat from Miao Li.
Yeah. the question is, how do I like considering cross-evidence relations sometimes conflict in fact-checking, which is to predict true false based on claim and evidences? Great question. Again, that's something that we don't handle very well, particularly if you just try to concatenate all the evidences together. But that said, people have come up with very simple approaches to handling situations where you have sort of a mixture of evidence that support and refute the claim. Sometimes you just give a label that says not enough information, or you say, I'm not sure, basically, or this is a mixture of truth, and you can't tell anymore. So that, at least from a labeling, from an annotation perspective, that's what people have done. Yeah.
Okay, I think unless there's anyone no questions, we might just stop there and take our afternoon tea. Okay. Great.
Thank you all.